This is Just Something About Her, a podcast from the Recount.
90% of women just trying to exercise their constitutional rights will be denied that in Texas. And if other states do identical laws, it's going to multiply across the country.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Palmieri. On this show, we're getting to the bottom of what still holds women back from women who are beating the odds. This week's guest, Senator Amy Klobuchar. Senator Klobuchar, welcome to Texas Trib Fest and Just Something About Her.
Well, thank you, Jen. It's great to see you.
I want to start with the news that you just revealed recently that you were diagnosed with breast cancer earlier this year.
It's something that no one wants to hear and no one wants to experience, but it's really renewed my faith in the people around me and in my purpose.
First of all, how are you feeling? How are you doing?
Oh, I'm feeling really good. This started back in February, routine mammogram. I'd put it off through the pandemic like so many women have. They actually believe thousands of women have undetected breast cancer right now. But I finally had it and they found it early enough and were able to remove the lump, and it was stage 1A. And then I had radiation in May. And then have a very good prognosis. They think my chances of getting cancer again are about the same as anyone in the general population. So that's good. But what I've learned through this journey, 1 out of 3 Americans have put off just routine exams, not just for cancer. And that's really scary because a lot of these things, if you catch them early, you're much better off. And then secondly, just what a gift every day is, including, everything from my husband getting up early for 5 days and driving me to radiation treatment, or the nurses at Mayo Clinic giving me a red, white, and blue mask when it was all done. It was a tough year. My dad died, a lot going on. But
and then John, your husband, had COVID too.
Yes.
Last year, your dad died. You're facing this, but you found that even though people didn't know that you were dealing with this illness, they were still offering some kind of kindness.
Right. It was really something. So anyway, and I have a renewed purpose of the work that we're doing, and everything from reducing the prices of prescription drugs, which is so important to really all people in the healthcare system, with the Medicare negotiation, which we're taking on now, to many, many other things we can do in the area of healthcare. So yeah, renewed purpose, that's correct. And also just gratefulness and gratitude for everything people did, including these incredible doctors and nurses, and all the people that have come up to me and said, okay, I called and scheduled my mammogram, I was putting it off. And it's very interesting, the things they think through in their minds. At first, it was understandable, the pandemic. Then they realized it was safer. Then some of them even told me they thought through, well, what if I do have cancer? Do I really want to go to the hospital right now?
Right. Because
no, it's worse to have cancer and have it keep going. So I think it's been really a positive that way to really get people thinking, to make some changes.
Yeah. This is, and renewed purpose. And there's a lot, I don't recall a fall like this ever. It's not, normally Congress comes back in fall. Oh, there's so much to do. You have to deal with the budget. Maybe you have to deal with reconciliation, but I just don't recall a time where the stakes are so high.
Agreed.
So I want to start.
I really do think the combination of the flooding and the fires all summer, and the need to move on clean energy and infrastructure and climate change, the need to do, I believe, more on immigration reform. When you look at some of the businesses in my state who need either temporary workers or permanent workers,
right.
When you look at what people are struggling, still balancing their toddlers on their knees and their laptops on their desk and teaching their kids how to use the mute button on Zoom calls. And a lot of people are back in person, that's great. But we're still, because of this variant, we need to get more people vaccinated. And then, what happened with Afghanistan, getting the refugees placed right now high on my list as a state that takes in a lot of refugees. So there is many, many things that are happening, but we still need to keep our eye on that long term of the economy, which to me means these Build Back Better agenda that's right before us.
It does not feel like any other time, and it does feel like we're at the breaking point in so many ways, with parents working from home and still having to deal with healthcare, with the floods and the fires that you described, in terms of climate change, the Delta variant, and then there's this cascade of efforts across the country in trying to take away people's rights.
Exactly. And I was thinking as you talked, even though all these things are such huge challenges, I actually do believe we're up to it. And I'll get to Texas in a minute. I do. I was thinking, remember when, and I think you were in the White House then with Obama when he first came in, and remember there was a downturn then, and they were going through all these things, including at the time, the Somali pirates. And he said,
I would love a nice lean portfolio to deal with, but that's not the hand that's been dealt us.
And I'm up for the challenge. And I believe that about this administration. And I know there's all these ancient procedural rules in the Senate that hold us back, but somehow we found a way to pass major legislation in the last year to get through the pandemic. And I continue to have hope. But let's get to Texas.
Okay, well, let's do it. Yeah, because I do want to kind of step back to say, like, what do you see that's actually happening in the country, and if you give us a little clue about how you think we deal with it, maybe it's like bit by bit. But Texas, specifically the Texas abortion bill. So some providers have said that up to 90% of women seeking abortions in the state would be prohibited from doing so under this bill. Can you explain why this bill is so alarming to you and why it's not just a problem for Texas? And I know that when you're on the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Supreme Court, this is sort of the worst case scenario for, it's not something I imagine kind of playing out this way, that the way we might face a Roe v. Wade test was kind of through this weird backdoor legislation and the Supreme Court getting a stay. But you had a very spirited back and forth with Amy Coney Barrett during her, you've come to think of it, you've had many spirited back and forths with Supreme Court justices.
Justice Kavanaugh, yes.
You're saying there's never been a case where you drank so much that you didn't remember what happened the night before or part of what happened.
You're asking about, blackout. I don't know. Have you?
Could you answer the question, Judge?
You all particularly talked about super precedents with Amy Coney Barrett, as it related to Roe v. Wade. So what do we need to worry about this bill, and how do you sort of see it playing out with the court?
Okay, as my daughter would say, that question was a lot. So let's start back with what's happened with the court, how we ended up where we are. And I predicted this, that these Trump justices, 3 of them, adding to the 2 conservatives that are already on the court. And then you have Justice Roberts, who, of course, is conservative, but in this case, in my mind, did the right thing, even though he may disagree in his own mind on some of the issues. He did the right thing under the law. So you had that 5-judge majority in the middle of the night, in Justice Kagan's words, less than 72 hours of thought, and they green-lighted, in her word, this law that clearly is unconstitutional under Roe v. Wade. Instead of giving what is called an emergency stay. And they've done that in 2015 and 2019 on abortion cases, one of them involving Texas, for egregious laws that were just as bad. But this one, to me, is even worse, and I'll get to that. So That's what happened. The court didn't give the stay, and now it's taking effect. You ask, is this just about Texas? It's not just about Texas, because you already have governors and conservative legislators in predictable states already saying, oh, we're going to try this now. We already have Mississippi. The Texas law says, basically, when you can hear a heartbeat, basically in 6 weeks. If you don't get in, if you're seeking abortion services and you don't get it by then you can't get it, or you can be reported and get in trouble. So what does that mean? Well, that means that, as you said, well over 90% of women just trying to exercise their constitutional rights will be denied that in Texas. And if other states, which we expect will happen, do identical laws, it's going to multiply across the country. So why this law is so bad, which I just explained, what makes it even worse is they've created bounty hunters in Texas. They basically have said, oh, well, If you find out a woman is seeking an abortion, you can report her and get $10,000. That means a neighbor that happens to overhear something. That means someone who hears a private conversation at a coffee shop. That could mean someone who drove someone. That could mean someone who's spying on an abortion clinic or any kind of a health clinic that provides abortions. It's just simply outrageous. And even Justice Roberts, in his own opinion in this case, he said it was highly unusual and unprecedented, and that basically Texas was ceding their power to enforce the laws to the general populace. Those are Justice Roberts' words, and he is not exactly a flaming liberal. I can't help but come forward and say the filibuster is just a huge impediment to moving forward on the big challenges of our time.
The Mississippi law that you referred to,
15.
I believe it's 15 weeks. It would prohibit abortion after 15 weeks. That is due to be heard by the Supreme Court this fall. And that's what everyone was looking towards to see where this could all get tested. The Biden Justice Department has filed a lawsuit against the Texas bill saying it's unconstitutional as well.
Well, and there already has been one state court finding to stop some of this. But how this will affect, first of all, Mississippi, one of the things I said in my questioning of Amy Coney Barrett was follow the tracks. And if you looked at her record, you follow the tracks, and it led you to believe that she was going to get rid of Roe v. Wade and those protections, basically. And I asked her specifically,
Is Roe a super precedent?
How would you define super precedent?
I might have thought someday I'd be sitting in that chair. I'm not. I'm up here, so I'm asking you.
Okay, well, people use super precedent differently.
Okay.
and she said no, she wouldn't say how she'd rule. And there were some people who naively said, see, she said she was like, no, follow the tracks. And so if you follow the tracks from this case that we just saw with the emergency thing, that would lead you to believe that we're going to see trouble from my perspective, in that Mississippi case. Meanwhile, back in Texas, you do see challenges being launched. Ultimately, in the federal courts, this will go to a district court, to circuit court, and the circuit court is notoriously conservative. It covers Texas. So that was the court that threw out the ACA. And it's a pretty dangerous situation. And to me, to get to solution, so this isn't all admiring the problem, the solution is, yes, the litigation. Yes, what the Justice Department can do, and you just never know, right? And the court still hasn't decided on the merits. Then the second piece is we should codify Roe v. Wade into law. That is the simplest way to solve this. Speaker Pelosi has started that bill in the House. We have a similar version that I'm a co-sponsor of in the Senate. And what you run into the Senate is, of course, the filibuster rules. And I think we should abolish the filibuster. All those things I talked about at the beginning, immigration reform, we have Republican votes on that. We do, but we can't get to 60. Okay. And that's what you need. Ridiculously, democracies don't usually work that way, right? You've got climate change. Yes, we can invest in infrastructure, but we're not going to be able to put greenhouse gas rules in place. And yes, when it comes to a woman's right to choose and abortion rights, we're not going to get to 60, even though we have several Republicans, 2 at least, on our side on this. And so that's why I would make the case for abolishing the filibuster.
You represent a relatively conservative state. You have a strong record of having worked bipartisan across the aisle. And you had a tweet on September 6th. This is shortly after the Supreme Court allowed the Texas state law to take effect. And you said, it's pretty simple. Unless we get rid of the filibuster, we're going to sit around admiring a lot of problems. Love that. And sending a lot of tweets. Instead, we should get something done. I feel like this is a pretty big statement for you. What was this journey like for you?
Sure.
Good question.
How
do you make the case for it?
So when I first came into the Senate, I was one of the reform people, right? President Obama was then a senator back then, and I was in the group that wanted reforms. And he was part of that. He was already in the Senate, but we made a bunch of ethical reforms, right? And there was got rid of the secret hold, did some things that were helpful. But to me, those were at the time those were baby steps. Then we started having meetings that they were meetings, but about how we could change the filibuster. And I was in that group. We talked about Senator Harkin at the time had a proposal to reduce the numbers. And Mondale was, who we just sadly lost, when he was a senator, he worked to reduce the number needed to break the filibuster from 67 to 60. They did it. So unbeknownst to, I think, a lot of people that hear about this debate, there have been reforms over the years to the filibuster, but we never really made movement on that. Even though I will say I am someone that strongly believes that you should do everything to work across the aisle, I don't find that inconsistent with an archaic rule that is just used to mess around with people now. It's used to, have us vote till 4 a.m, night after night, and people are just messing around. And I don't think that's good for bipartisan legislation, for any legislation. And so, in the last year or so, I've been very clear on my position, which has been developed over time, which is that I just think we got to get rid of it. And, there is some talk about carving it out for certain bills like the voting bill, which I would, of course, favor. I would favor abolishing it overall. There's talk of reducing the numbers again, which could help in certain cases. And then there is talk about a standing filibuster. That means you'd still have to change rules, but it's making the other side basically argue their case day after day after day, instead of just being able to pull a procedural switch and then go home and watch TV, which is what's happening right now.
But do you worry about this? I mean, you've clearly decided in favor of action. The president recently made a decision about vaccination mandates. It's like, we've just got to come down on the side of science. I think you're advocating when it comes to climate change. You're advocating that, the end of the filibuster for voting rights. I know you sponsored the For the People Act for abortion rights. Climate change is another one. And do you worry about the blowback I'm sure you do worry about the blowback in the country, but how do you see this playing out? It's just that we have to be we got to be with the facts, or how do you want to do that?
I couldn't help but listen to the word blowback, and I thought, well, the blowback to me right now is that Duluth, Minnesota had one day the worst air quality that it's had in the history of recording air quality. Or we had these fires raging in northern Minnesota when no one thought that could happen to that extent. Same thing you've seen in California. The hurricanes coming in, that's major blowback. Okay, so we can just put our heads in the sand and say, oh, we have this old rule, we can't do anything. I just think the American people expect more. And in terms of the political blowback, as Georgia showed us, by the way, in the Senate races there, and as Reverend Senator Warnock's incredibly strong support for changes to voting rights, and the filibuster in order to get to that point, that just, to me, that just shows that the world has changed here. We can't just keep sitting around, as I said, and admiring the problem. At some point, you have to do something. Now, does it have to be one way? No, because we know there's still going to be negotiations. We still have a large group of moderates in both the House and the Senate, and even conservative Democrats like Senator Manchin. So there's still going to be negotiations going on about the content. But at least we will be able to respond in some way to the crises of our time, which includes people trying to suppress the vote, which includes the fires and the hurricanes, which includes this assault on women's rights. And I still think you're going to have compromise and some Republican support for things, just like I was a big supporter of the infrastructure bill that we've just passed in the Senate and worked on that. The broadband piece of it especially was my piece of legislation. But I just think we've got to, at some point, be honest. This isn't bringing people together. What brings people together is when they feel that their country is moving as one team. And there have been many moments even through the worst of times politically, where everyone's had that feeling in their local communities, where people stood up and volunteered and helped each other, when they, embraced the healthcare workers, when we passed these bills that basically kept our restaurants afloat and our music venues afloat. Those were all moments where, by the way, working Senator Cornyn of Texas and I working together, leading our bill on Save Our Stages. There's been moments, especially in local communities, where people have reached out. So I just refuse to lose hope on all of this. But I can't help but come forward and say the filibuster is just a huge impediment to moving forward on the big challenges of our time. I just refuse to give up on America here. I think that despite the polarization, that there are ways to find common ground.
When you see this sort of like assault on rights across the board, the voting rights, abortion rights, Republicans still clinging to the big lie, the notion that Biden did not actually win the presidential election. What do you see as the actual fight that we're having?
I think Trump is contributing not to all of this, but a lot of this by not conceding, which just has not happened in American history, not conceding that he lost the election while every single high-ranking justice official has said that. So I do believe when you look at the insurrection, and I just completed with Senators Blunt and Portman and Peters investigation of what we needed to do to protect the security of the Capitol there.
That was your other big moment in 2020,
yes,
of course, was having to, as the chair of the Senate Rules Committee.
And that it wasn't a picnic. You mean that moment? Yeah, but the point is that from the moment that insurrection happened, I vowed as head of the Rules Committee, I was incoming head at that time, that we were going to finish our job. And 2 weeks later, we took back that platform. And I will never forget not only that night where Senator Blunt and Vice President Pence and I walked through broken glass with these two young women with a mahogany box filled with the remaining electoral ballots to finish our job, but 2 weeks later, when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were sworn in as the next president and vice president, with all the leadership of the parties, of course, Donald Trump didn't show up, but his vice president did, and George Bush did, sitting on the very platform that they had taken over with spray paint, still tried to be washed out, but still evident on the columns and makeshift glass behind us. And as I said that day, it was a moment where our country and our democracy brushed itself off and moved forward as we always do, one country under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And it does seem that what you're saying is Congress does their job bit by bit. There are huge challenges, but if you start getting things done, people see Congress is working for them, representing them, solving problems, sometimes in a bipartisan way, but most importantly, solving problems. That's the path back. That's how we sort of unravel some of this. Is that how you see it?
I think that is, and that we demonstrated, as I noted a few times, the last year when we had to respond, and we did in major ways to keep the economy going and to get the vaccines distributed. And we even did that last year and had to, sometimes without any leadership from the White House, we kept going. And now we have Joe Biden in, and he is, leading the administration in a way, to me, that is much more competent, and we are moving ahead. So I just refuse to give up on America here. I think that despite the polarization, that there are ways to find common ground, but I refuse to allow ancient procedural rules that were done to not get certain things done, as in civil rights legislation that were put in place to define our future.
Right now, you don't have the votes to get rid of the filibuster or for filibuster reform, but you see value in continuing to argue for it because that's the path for it to get it done. What's the path?
I do. I think you just have to keep making the case. As rights are stripped away state by state by state, you make the case. As these voter suppression bills get enacted, so that in Georgia, volunteers can't even give water out to voters when they have 3-4 hour lines like they did in the last election. And the worst of it isn't even that. The worst of it is the runoff period, which is where Senator Warnock and Ossoff got elected. You can't vote on weekends during that time anymore, even though you can vote on weekends before, maximizing confusion. These things are so evil and they're so bad that I refuse to stop making the case. And also, you have had some signaling. Senator Manchin has said he's open to a standing filibuster, which would be one way to do this. And so I just keep making the case.
So I'm going to let you go, but one thing I'll just say in closing is that I watched your presidential campaign with great interest, as you know, because
I know you were on the road.
One thing I will say, women that run for president are definitely held to double standards. And I do see progress in that when I would go to your events, what people would say about you, just something about her, right? There was just something about you that they liked. What they would say was, she's so real, she's so authentic. Those are not words often said about politicians, particularly women, given all of the double standards that they battle. So a conversation for another day, but I do.
Well, I do also think the fact that we had so many women running just made a difference in races all across the country, unrelated to presidential. It wasn't just one candidate. On the first night of the first debate, we doubled the number of Democratic women on the primary stage ever. And the fact that they had different political views, were from different parts of the country, look different. Whoa, wore different clothes. Woo. I think all of that was really good for America. So,
amen. Amen. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thanks, Jennifer.